At a conference organized by the Institute of International Business and Governance held at the Open University of Hong Kong, Professor Peter Buckley, founder-director of the Center for International Business at the University of Leeds, gave the following keynote speech exploring the ways in which corporations contribute to the well-being of society. Do corporations contribute to societal goals through their own selfish volition, or do they need to be constrained by regulation and coerced into contributing beyond meeting their own selfish goals? His findings have important implications for corporations in today's society.
What I'm going to talk about this morning is a research project that I've been carrying out for the British Academy. The British Academy has a major program called The Future of the Corporation. And the idea is to look at the role of corporation in modern society, how the corporation has changed and how it can contribute to the well-being of society. Are the current arrangements fit for purpose? Do they achieve societal goals and so on? So there was a competition for research grants, and I was successful in getting one. And the reason I think that I was successful in getting one of these awards is the simplicity of my research project. And simple things are the best way of approaching things, right? Ask a simple question and the answers turn out to be very complex. But if you can keep the simple question and keep that in the forefront of your mind, then I think you've got a good research project. That's always been my philosophy. So the simple question that I asked, and the simple question that is the basis for this research project, is this one. Can corporations contribute to society directly or only through regulated behaviour? In other words, do corporations have to be regulated? Do we have to have state control and other forms of regulation in order for corporations to contribute to society? And that's the question that I'm looking at. So, there are two questions then that arise from this. The first one is the main question, and that is, can corporations contribute through their own volition? Can we allow, if you want to put it that way, can we allow corporations to, as it were, do their own thing and to come out of that with a contribution to society? Now, the way I put this question to the interviewees, and I had a small sample of interviewees, 14, but they were all very senior executives, people running multinationals, senior advisors, and so on. And this is the way that I put the question: can corporations contribute to societal goals through their own volition, or do they need to be constrained by regulation into contributing beyond their own selfish goals? Now, the reason that is in red is that there are a number of these senior executives who questioned the question. They said, is it a good way of starting this by saying that corporations are selfish? And here we've got a major philosophical issue. And that is what corporations do, even if they're acting, quotes, selfishly, pursuing profit, pursuing market share, pursuing growth, is that selfish? And of course, there's a well-known position put by Milton Friedman that what corporations should do is maximize profits. And by maximizing profits, they're doing what they're good at, and everyone else can go ahead and do what they're good at, but corporations, in pursuing their selfish goals, will do things like create employment, create new products, satisfy consumers, and so on. So we have an immediate issue there about the role of corporations in society. Is what corporations do normally, in the normal course of their business, is that selfish or does that contribute to societal goals? And by societal goals, I mean things like sustainability and issues like that. I'll go into that a little later. So the second question then, following on from the first one, is if corporations are going to contribute to societal good through non-regulated behaviour, through their own decisions, and to try and achieve something wider than selfish goals, how should they do this? And there are two perhaps key mechanisms that suggest themselves. One is the creation of incentives for executives. So when executives take decisions, they are rewarded on what they contribute to the corporation, to the company that employs them. Could that be wider? Could we think of a situation where we incentivize senior managers, decision makers, the people who set the policy for the company, can we incentivize them to do, quotes, societal good? For instance, can we link rewards to the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, which is an obvious set of targets? Is it feasible to reward executives not just on the way they contribute to their own company, but is it feasible to actually incentivize them to do wider social good, to contribute to the social goals in the sense of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? The other suggestion is that individual incentives are a poor way of doing this. They don't actually address the question. And what we need to do is create a company culture that is more in line with the greater good of society. Now, it's possible to argue that we should do both of these things. We should try and incentivize executives to achieve wider social goals, and we should also try to foster a company culture that's aligned to the greater good of society. So when we look then generally at the contribution of corporations to society, we have these two choices. We have companies being regulated. In other words, they're constrained by government policy, maybe even international rules and regulations. Or should they be encouraged to take autonomous social action? Should the corporations not only be regulated, but also have their own abilities, their own policies, their own ways of contributing to social goals? And here we have another interesting issue, and that is the role of compliance versus wider initiative. One argument is if you regulate corporations, if you have strict rules on what corporations do, you will get compliance. Companies will comply with these regulations, they'll stay within the regulations, but they won't necessarily go beyond it. One of the executives that I interviewed said the following, that companies should own the goals. They shouldn't be constrained to the goals. They should own them. They should be built into the way that executives take decisions. And then a third question that arises is the role of regulatory authority versus good governance. Regulations don't always get it right. Governments don't always get it right. Is good governance directly by the corporation a better way of proceeding, a better way of achieving societal goals? So you can see that these are pretty basic and interesting questions. And these are the two mechanisms that I particularly looked at: the role of incentives to achieve corporate goals and the creation of a corporate culture centered on social goals. It's possible to think of doing both, but those were the mechanisms that I particularly talked about. Both of them have got real issues. The first issue, of course, is how you design the incentives and whether you get conflict of incentives. So how would this work if a manager had to decide between contributing profit to the company versus doing social good? How would that trade-off work? How would we manage that? And the second thing is the creation of a corporate culture. When we're talking about huge corporations, when we're talking about multinationals that operate in lots and lots of different countries, is it possible to have a single corporate culture that drives the decisions of that? One of the managers that I talked to said one of the problems is that culture exists within pockets within the corporation. Some parts of the company may well have the right social goals, but it's very difficult to diffuse that throughout the company. So those are potential mechanisms that I'm going to look at. This, if you like, is the compliance model. This is the idealized model, if you like, of how companies comply with external decisions. So the argument is that the moral basis for the policy agenda is set at a societal level, maybe at an international level. For instance, by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are possibly the most well thought of and well understood, and within companies well understood. There are a lot of companies that actually monitor and measure their activities in accord with their contribution to the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a survey that KPMG does every year of companies to see how far they have gone along with Sustainable Development Goals. And my impression, and I talked to 14 companies, so let's not say it's more than an impression. My impression is that the executives are very well aware of this and are gradually starting to look at their company policies in line with Sustainable Development Goals. Patchy, yes, but beginning. So the argument would then be that the Sustainable Development Goals, or the societal goals, are then embedded in national government policy. So the idea would be that national government policies comply with the moral goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and whatever it is. And this is transmitted through national, regional, maybe even local regulations to which companies have to apply. Now, you can see that there's already going to be some attrition. These are not necessarily all going to be adopted. And in the current framework, where there are a lot of leading governments, let me not mention any names, that perhaps don't go along with this, we may already have problems. So the second stage then is that the social goals become embodied in regulations, treaties, and agreements, and then economic actors, such as multinational corporations, such as companies, respond to these initiatives in their decision making. So we have different levels of this, and then the companies implement these, and we have the direct policy results, and of course we'll have some unintended consequences. We'll have some problems arising from that. So that's a kind of the received model of how social goals get built into the decisions of large companies. But let's look at the second alternative, the proactive strategies. So again, we have the promulgation of societal goals, but then we have a direct implementation of these goals, these objectives, into company policy through the mechanism perhaps of incentives, or through possibly the adoption of a company culture that goes along with it. And again, then this has direct policy results and unintended consequences. The virtue of this type of approach is it's more direct. It misses out one level. Secondly, we could argue that some governments' policies are not exactly in line with, we can't always assume that government policy is right and what companies do is not right. And so if we were thinking along the lines of governments are not behaving in an internationally responsible fashion, in other words, they were prioritizing their own interests or sectional interests or whatever it is, maybe this is a way that companies can more directly achieve social goals than going through the role of regulation. So when we look at the role of compliance, we look at compliance and we look at social purpose, we can see various types of policy. If we look at that on the left, we have compliance and value preserving. This is where the minimalist type of approach. So reduce harm to stakeholders and comply with the law and corporate standards. Now you'll notice for the first time there, I've got corporate social responsibility, CSR, in the top left-hand corner. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And where we've got regulated practice, we're just complying with the law, bottom left-hand corner. So bottom left-hand corner is a very minimalist approach. We just comply with the law, we do what we're told. That's the minimalist position. On the top side, we can look at CSR and we can look at reducing harm to stakeholders. Or on the bottom right, we can incorporate integrity and values, create values. And of course, there is the creating social value movement that started with Nestle, where the idea is you try and build in, you try and create social value by the actions of the company. On the top right is a very proactive strategy where the companies actually go out to try and create value for society, not just for themselves. So, there are essentially three types of pro-societal behavior in companies. The first type is to do good by being good, just to operate, just to conduct the company in the best possible way, to try and comply with everything, to try and not do any harm, to try and do good by being good. So this is the arguments, this is kind of slightly beyond the Friedman argument, where we try and create value, we try and create employment, we try and create good products, sustainable products, ethical products, and so on. The second stage is we go on to create socially responsible activities, CSR activities. But these don't necessarily impose costs on the business. There are many companies where CSR is a means of reaching particular consumers, right? We're reaching ethical consumers. It's a way of getting investment into the company by having socially responsible activities, giving to charity, all the rest of it, and creating new products. So most of the time, companies can go along with CSR activities without really without really undertaking any cost to themselves. But the third case is what we might call burdensome responsibility. This is the position where companies will actually choose socially responsible activities, even though it imposes significant costs on the company, even though they may lose out. There may be significant costs in terms of profit, slower growth, or whatever it is. So we've got different levels of companies being able to contribute to society, from a fairly minimalist, do no harm, do what good you can, to add-ons from CSR, to a real undertaking that we will sacrifice value, we will sacrifice profits in order to achieve societal goals. So the argument here is that the the first two cases are not really taking on massive social responsibility. The third category is the really important one, where there are non-trivial costs to the company, where the company is actually prepared to sacrifice some of its goals in order to achieve societal good. And therefore, in some senses, this might be a substitute for government regulation. CSR activities are complementary and necessary, but not substitutes for government regulation. Now, why would we be interested? Why is there a case for saying that government regulation is important? Well, government regulation and regulation of business solves two very significant problems. First of all, it solves the governance problem, because if you have government regulation, the company does not have to justify itself to its investors, to its other stakeholders. It doesn't have to justify diverting resources away from other activities to so-called non-productive aims. If there is government regulation, then the company has to comply, and it's not having to justify diverting resources. Secondly, most businesses, of course, are competitive. They have competitors. And if you are diverting resources into less profitable activities, you could lose out in terms of competition. But if governments regulate everybody in the industry, then everybody's facing similar investments, similar trade-offs, similar costs. And so government regulation has virtues in solving the governance problem and the problem of competitive dynamics. It may still be the case that the better firms, the firms that are more forward-looking, who are more able to deal with compliance because they already have this philosophy, they already have a contribution to social goals, may still benefit. But regulation helps to level the playing field in the current terms that we use. Now, there's a huge problem here, a huge problem and a growing problem. And that is that regulation, and indeed all forms of government activity, compliance or non-compliance or whatever, is heavily information intensive. In order to design, in order to conduct successful, effective, and efficient legislation, a great deal of information is necessary. However, a great deal of that information, an increasing amount of that information, if we think of digital companies and we think of all the troubles with the big digital companies, they hold the information. So regulation of information-intensive companies is becoming an increasing problem. So firms can, in fact, contribute to the social good by providing the information that successful regulation needs. So, for instance, in environmental regulation, a lot of private firms develop the technologies for environmental best practice. And making those available, the knowledge of those available to regulators, is extremely important in achieving effective regulation and achieving effective environmental regulation in the future. So the issue now becomes one, not of command and control, where the regulators have all the information, they can impose the regulations on the companies. There has to be much more of a negotiated relationship between the regulators and the regulated, which is a massively different mindset from sitting back and allowing the regulation to occur and then complying with it, or indeed we're still trying to avoid the regulation, there has to be a kind of partnership in terms of information. So this necessitates collaboration between companies and regulators. And as we know from our everyday lives, and as we know from the press even today, the interconnectedness of markets and technologies means that even more private information is needed for effective regulation and for the achievement of the goals that we're ultimately working towards. So particularly in the case of the new digital economy, as we all know, how firms collect, process and disseminate information and how they influence citizens and consumers is extremely important. So there needs to be then a new balance between regulators and regulated because of the control of technological knowledge. So burdensome responsibility in these terms means not only complying, increasing costs possibly, losing revenue, it also means responsible participation, providing information to the regulators in order for effective regulation. To turn to a slightly different issue, corporations are subject to a number of pressures. Corporations are subject to a number of pressures in terms of governance. And this, I think, is a really interesting way of, it's not my idea, this, unfortunately, but it's a very good idea, the argument about the governance triangle. Companies not only face governance through competition, right, bottom right-hand corner. They have regulation, the state, governance through coordination, top of the triangle. But further, they have governance arising from civil society, from argumentation, pressure on them for sustainable investment, pressure on them for sustainable products, pressure on them through the consumer, through suppliers, through distributors, and so on. So we begin to get the idea that regulation and the market are only two parts of the pressures on companies to conform to different forms of governance. So the role of civil society then as stakeholders are becoming increasingly important. The role of consumers demanding ethical products, demanding sustainability, demanding that companies do no harm. The role of ethical funds. One of my interviewees was the leader of an ethical funds investment, which can put tremendous pressure on corporations, even if they're not majority owners. They have a voice at the investment, at the stake, at the shareholders' meetings. They can put all kinds of pressure. They can conduct campaigns, and these pressures are increasing. A further one, and this came out very, very surprisingly strongly in the interviews that I conducted, was the role of employees, especially younger employees, who not only want to work for a company that will provide them a good standard of living and security, but want to feel that they own the goals of the company, want to feel that the goals of the company are not totally at odds with their ethical beliefs. So a lot of the senior executives that I talked to felt pressure coming from the younger employees, putting pressure on the company as a whole to behave more ethically or to behave more sustainability and so on. So there's an increase in the pressure on business from civil society. The role of civil society, particularly in the information age where we can all post our opinions, we can all whistle-blow if we're brave enough, we can all go on Twitter or whatever to put pressure on companies. This is a really important and growing thing. So those things together, ethical consumers, ethical investors, and if you like, ethical employees, are all growing in strength. And a lot of the companies are increasingly aware that, for instance, if they want to attract the best talent, they have to do so not only by offering a good package, they have to also offer the kind of goals that people would conform with. So what I'm suggesting is what I call a web of constraint, that companies are actually operating within a whole web of rules and signals, only some of which come from governments. I started off by talking about regulation and government regulation. That is only one of this web of constraints on the modern corporation. Others come from things like standards, global standards. Where you're running a supply chain, or you're part of a supply chain, very often the whole of that supply chain will be governed by particular standards. And the ISO, the Standards Organization, has now got regulations not only on compliance with technical standards, but compliance with ethical standards and with sustainable development goals. And you can sign up for an ISO and then you're regulated on that. So if you're part of a supply chain that has these standards, you too are constrained to go along with this. And there are a number of companies that I interviewed that emphasize this as one of the key issues in developing their policies because of the role of standards. Consumer expectations are another major constraint. Supplier demands, civil society norms. So corporations are increasingly subject to signals that come from all these things, from stakeholders, not just as price signals, but through means such as social movements, ownership changes, and lobbying. Now, the companies also, by the way, something I've not mentioned, influence regulation through lobbying. So you've got a two-way relationship here. So corporations are not just passive receivers of these rules and signals, they also make them. And business organizations collectively and individually are playing a role in designing this web. Now, one of the other things I haven't talked about particularly is the role of place in this. As an international business person, I definitely should. Rules and regulations differ by where you are and where you operate, and they mutate over time. So this web, this constraints, this set of constraints, this set of rules and signals is changing very much over time. So where companies are domiciled and where they operate are crucial determinants of behavior. And of course, one of the things that's very evident to people who work in international business is that the distance between the decision makers and where the operations are can often be a problem, right? It's often in distant operations, the Bangladesh crisis and all the rest of it, where managers are divorced from activities on the ground by distance, by time, by culture. And again, this is an important influence on this web of constraints. So the results of what I looked at and the results of the first part of this research project is that all these issues, all these elements of governance represent a choice for the management of corporations. Government policy is not the sole, very often it's not even the major determinant of governance, although it's a very important one. And corporations can go beyond what individual governments require. So sometimes they go beyond it because they're forced to. They're forced to by these societal pressures. Sometimes they go beyond it because their goals suggest they should go beyond it. All the companies that I talked to were large, typically capitalist corporations, multinational firms. They weren't social enterprises, although I talked to social enterprises separately. And where you have those goals in, that changes things dramatically. A lot of the companies felt that this, because of this web of regulations, the need to conform with these web of regulations, that company culture is an extremely important mechanism in doing this. There was less support for incentives, direct incentives to managers for doing this. This was felt to be a fairly crude tool, a difficult one to implement, and also some people suggested that actually giving monetary rewards to achieve social goals almost defeats the object of what you're trying to do. So if we're going to talk about giving incentives to managers to achieve social goals, I think we need to do a lot more careful thinking about the corporation and so on. So the conclusion that I came to, the conclusion that I've come to about this, is that regulation on its own is not sufficient, and companies need to go beyond compliance in order to achieve social goals. But I think what we also have to remember, in the typical way we think about companies, perhaps in business schools, perhaps in sort of theories of how companies behave, is that companies themselves are not completely autonomous. They don't have complete freedom to do what they like because they're bounded by these rules, standards, norms, and social pressures. So the future of the corporation, which is the research project that I'm part of, seems to me to be changing very rapidly. The nature of the corporation, I was quite surprised in doing the interviews that I did with the companies about the awareness of the changes in rules, signals, regulations, standards that companies have to comply to. So looking at government regulations only a very partial way of looking at the way that companies are developing and the way that they are beginning to build in social goals, patchily, differentially, and so on. But the pressure is definitely there to get companies to take more care of their social impact as well as their economic impact. Thank you very much.